Please like and subscribe to help the channel. The sea was never empty. Even before maps, before empires, before names were given to oceans and coastlines, there were men who looked at water and saw opportunity, not discovery, not trade, but taking. Because piracy did not begin as a profession. It began as instinct. A ship moves slowly. A ship carries goods. A ship cannot escape easily once surrounded. And somewhere, long before history was written, someone understood that and acted on it, not as a pirate, because that word did not exist yet, but as something older, something simpler, a raider. The earliest traces do not come as stories. They come as fear. Burned settlements, broken trade routes, cargo that never arrived, and whispers of ships that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. In the ancient Mediterranean, where early civilizations rose along coastlines, trade became lifeblood. Grain, oil, metal, precious goods moving between lands that depended on each other. And where there is movement, there is vulnerability, because every journey creates a gap, a space between origin and destination, a stretch of uncertainty where control disappears. And in that space, piracy is born. The earliest known maritime raiders are often connected to something unclear, something fragmented, something feared more than understood. The Sea Peoples. They were not one nation, not one tribe, not one identity. They were movement, destruction across coastlines, appearing suddenly, striking relentlessly, leaving behind collapse. Ports burned, cities fell, trade routes shattered. And for a moment in time, the Mediterranean itself felt unstable, as if the sea had turned against those who depended on it. They did not just raid ships. They attacked entire civilizations. And yet, they were not pirates in the way we understand the word. They were something larger, closer to invasion. But within their actions, the pattern was already forming. Movement, interception, taking, disappearing. That pattern would repeat for thousands of years. Because piracy is not tied to culture. It is tied to opportunity. As civilizations stabilized, as trade networks expanded, as ships became more advanced, the sea did not become safer. It became richer, and richer seas attract sharper eyes. In ancient Greece, where islands scattered across the Aegean created natural pathways, ships moved constantly. Merchants, soldiers, explorers, and amongst them, raiders, small groups, fast vessels, striking where defenses were weakest. Not armies, not fleets, but calculated threats. Because piracy thrives not in open war, but in gaps between power. The Greeks themselves did not always see piracy as wrong. Not at first. In early periods, raiding was simply part of life, a way to gain wealth, a test of strength, a demonstration of skill. The line between pirate and warrior did not exist clearly, because morality at sea had not yet formed. What mattered was success. What mattered was survival. And the sea rewarded those who acted first. But as societies grew more complex, as trade became more essential, as stability became valuable. That perception began to change, because piracy disrupts order, and order is what empires depend on. Nowhere was this more visible than in Rome. The Roman world expanded across land, but it depended on the sea. Grain from Egypt, goods from across the Mediterranean, supply lines that fed cities, that sustained armies, that maintained control. And piracy threatened all of it, not as occasional nuisance, but as growing force. Entire fleets of pirates began to form, not random raiders anymore, but organized groups, with bases, with systems, with influence. They captured ships, demanded ransom, disrupted entire regions, and at one point, they became so powerful that even Roman officials were not safe. The sea had slipped beyond control, and Rome responded the only way an empire could, with overwhelming force. A man was chosen, a general, not just to fight pirates, but to erase them. Pompey. He was given authority unlike anything seen before. Control over vast regions, power to act without delay, freedom to move faster than the problem itself. And he did not hesitate, because piracy relies on mobility. And to defeat it, you must be faster, more coordinated, more relentless. Pompey divided the sea, segmented it, cleared it piece by piece, systematically, efficiently, without hesitation. Pirate bases were destroyed, ships captured, leaders executed, or absorbed into Roman control. And within a surprisingly short time, the Mediterranean became safer. Not completely safe, but controlled. And that distinction matters, because piracy is never fully eliminated. It is only suppressed, pushed back, contained, until the next opportunity appears. And opportunity always returns, because as long as goods move across water, as long as wealth travels between distant places, as long as control cannot cover every mile of ocean, piracy remains possible. After Rome, after Greece, after early civilizations rose and fell, the pattern did not disappear. It adapted. In different regions, different forms emerged. Along the coasts of the Indian Ocean, trade routes stretched farther than ever before. Spices, silk, precious goods moving between east and west. And with that movement came raiders, not always called pirates, sometimes traders who turned violent, sometimes coastal groups who saw ships as opportunity, sometimes organized fleets operating outside any law. The same pattern, different names, different faces, same instinct. In the South China Sea, the scale grew even larger. Entire pirate confederations would eventually form there. But even in early periods, the foundation was already being built. Because geography matters. Narrow straits, hidden coves, island chains that allow ships to disappear within minutes. Perfect conditions for piracy. And pirates understand geography better than anyone, because survival depends on it. They do not fight where they are strong. They fight where others are weak. And the sea is full of weakness, not because it is empty, but because it is too vast to control completely. Across all these regions, across all these centuries, one truth remained constant. Piracy is not rebellion. It is exploitation. It does not seek to overthrow systems. It seeks to take advantage of them. Quietly, quickly, effectively. And that is why it persists. Because every system has gaps. Every empire has blind spots. Every trade route has moments of vulnerability. And in those moments, pirates appear, not as monsters, not as legends, but as reflections of opportunity taken to its extreme. They are not separate from the world. They are shaped by it, by its wealth, by its movement, by its imbalance. And in that sense, piracy is not an exception to history. It is part of it, an undercurrent, always present, sometimes hidden, sometimes overwhelming, but never gone. Because the sea, for all its beauty, for all its vastness, for all its importance, has never belonged fully to anyone. And anything that belongs to no one can be taken again and again and again. Power changes the sea, but it never removes its dangers. After Rome forced control over piracy, after Pompey carved order into chaos, for a time, the waters grew quieter, not peaceful, but predictable. Trade resumed, routes stabilized, empires expanded with confidence, and for a moment, it seemed like piracy had been defeated. But the sea does not remember victories. It only reflects opportunity. And opportunity does not disappear. It waits, because suppression is not destruction. It is delay. And delay always ends. As the Roman Empire stretched itself across continents, its strength became its weakness. Too much land, too many borders, too many threats, and slowly, almost quietly, control over the sea began to weaken. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. Naval patrols became thinner. Attention shifted inland. Resources were pulled away, and the spaces between power returned. And where space returns, piracy follows. At first, small incidents, a ship missing, a route disrupted, a merchant vessel found empty. Then more, vaster, closer to major trade lines, until once again, the sea began to feel uncertain. But this time, something had changed. Pirates were no longer just opportunists. They were learning, adapting, becoming more organized. Because history leaves patterns behind. And those patterns can be studied. As Rome declined, the Mediterranean did not fall silent. It fractured into smaller powers, smaller kingdoms, weaker controls, and fragmented authority is ideal for piracy, because no single force can dominate the sea completely. And without dominance, there is always a gap. But piracy was not confined to the Mediterranean. Not anymore, because trade itself had expanded. Across continents, across oceans, across distances that once seemed impossible. And with that expansion, new seas became active. New routes became vulnerable. New opportunities emerged. In the east, the Indian Ocean carried immense wealth. Ships moved between Arabia, India, East Africa, and beyond, carrying spices, gold, textiles, knowledge, and where wealth moves, eyes follow. Pirates in these regions were not always outsiders. Often, they were part of the system itself. Sailors who turned, traders who adapted, coastal communities who saw ships not as visitors, but as targets, because the line between commerce and piracy is thinner than it appears, especially when survival is uncertain, especially when wealth passes by within reach, but never stops. And so, the same pattern repeated. Movement, interception, taking, disappearing, but now on a larger scale, across longer distances, with more at stake. In Southeast Asia, the geography itself shaped piracy into something even more dangerous. Thousands of islands, hidden channels, narrow passages, places where a ship could vanish within moments. And in these waters, piracy became not just common, but expected, because controlling such an environment is nearly impossible, even for powerful states. And pirates understood that. They used the land, the water, the complexity of the terrain to their advantage, because piracy is not just about strength. It is about positioning, and no one positions themselves better than those who have nothing to lose. As centuries passed, a new kind of maritime force began to emerge. Not exactly pirates, but not entirely lawful either. Raiders of the North, sailors of cold seas, warriors who moved with speed and precision. The Vikings. They came from lands where survival was difficult, where resources were limited, where expansion was not a choice, but a necessity. And when they turned to the sea, they did not do so cautiously. They did so completely. Their ships were different. Long, narrow, vast, designed not just for ocean travel, but for rivers, for sudden landings, for escape. They did not rely on large fleets. They relied on speed, on surprise, on timing. They struck monasteries, coastal towns, trade routes, anywhere wealth was stored without sufficient protection. And when they struck, they did not stay. They took, they burned, they left. And by the time a response formed, they were gone. This was piracy, but it was also more. Because the Vikings did not just raid. They explored. They settled. They expanded. And that blurred the line even further between pirate and conqueror. Because when does raiding become invasion? And when does invasion become empire? The answer is not always clear. And in that uncertainty, piracy evolves. The Vikings were feared, not just for their violence, but for their unpredictability. They did not follow established routes. They created their own. They did not respect boundaries. They ignored them. And in doing so, they exposed something important: that the sea is not controlled by borders, only by presence. And where presence is weak, control is illusion. Across Europe, their impact was immense. Kings responded. Defenses were built. Navies strengthened. But even then, the raids continued. Because piracy is not stopped by reaction alone. It requires constant vigilance, constant presence, constant control, and few societies can maintain that forever. Eventually, the Viking Age began to fade, not because piracy disappeared, but because it transformed. As kingdoms stabilized, as Christianity spread, as trade networks became more structured, the open raiding of Viking fleets became less sustainable. But the knowledge remained. The techniques remained. The understanding of the sea remained. And those would influence what came next. Because piracy does not vanish with people. It passes through them, through generations, through systems, through opportunity. And as the world moved forward, toward greater exploration, toward larger trade empires, toward oceans that connected entire continents, the foundation had already been laid. Everything learned from the past, every pattern of attack, every method of interception, every weakness discovered, would carry forward into a new age, an age where piracy would become something even larger, more global, more complex, more infamous. But for now, the sea remained what it had always been, a space between worlds, a gap between powers, a place where control fades and instinct takes over. And as long as that space exists, piracy will never truly end. It will only change form, waiting for the next moment of weakness. The sea was growing wider, not in size, but in meaning, because for the first time in human history, it was no longer just a boundary. It was a bridge. Empires had risen along coastlines before. Trade had crossed waters before. But now, something different was beginning. The world itself was opening. And when the world opens, so do its dangers. Across Europe, a new hunger had taken hold, not for survival alone, but for expansion, for wealth beyond borders, for routes that bypassed rivals. And that hunger pushed ships further than ever before, into waters that were not mapped, not controlled, not understood. Men began to sail not just along coasts, but across oceans. And with them, they carried something new. Not just goods, but possibility. At the center of this shift stood figures who would redefine the sea. Explorers, or at least, that is what history would call them. Men like Christopher Columbus, who crossed the Atlantic not knowing exactly what lay ahead, not searching for piracy, but unknowingly creating its next great stage. Because every new route creates new vulnerability. Every discovery creates new imbalance. And imbalance is where piracy thrives. The age of exploration did not begin with pirates, but it made them inevitable. As Spain and Portugal expanded outward, they did not just explore. They extracted gold, silver, resources taken from newly encountered lands, loaded onto ships, sent across vast oceans, back toward Europe. And those ships, heavy with wealth, slow with burden, became something else entirely. Targets, because the scale had changed. Before, pirates attacked for survival, for modest gain, for opportunity. Now, a single ship could carry more wealth than entire regions had seen before. And that changes behavior. Because when the reward grows, so does the risk worth taking. Across the Atlantic, a new space formed, not fully controlled by any one empire, not fully mapped, not fully secured. The Caribbean, a region of islands, shallow waters, hidden coves, and endless routes for ships to pass through. Perfect for trade, perfect for ambush, perfect for piracy. Spain dominated these waters first. Its fleets moved regularly, transporting treasure from the Americas back to Europe. Organized, protected, but not invulnerable, because protection creates patterns, and patterns can be studied. Other European powers watched closely. England, France, the Netherlands. They did not have Spain's early advantage, but they had something else: patience and strategy. Because if you cannot control the wealth, you can intercept it. And that idea changed everything. Governments began to realize something dangerous: that piracy could be useful, if controlled, if directed, if justified. And so, a new type of pirate emerged. Not outlaw, not entirely, not hero, not entirely. Something in between. The privateer. Men given permission by their governments to attack enemy ships, to raid, to take, to disrupt rival empires, but under a legal cover. A document, a letter, authority granted on paper. One of the most famous among them was Francis Drake. To Spain, he was a pirate, a criminal, a threat to their empire. To England, he was a hero, a weapon, a symbol of resistance. And that contradiction is important, because piracy is not always defined by action. It is defined by perspective. Who you attack, who supports you, who writes the history. Drake raided Spanish ships, attacked ports, captured treasure, and returned to England not as a criminal, but celebrated, knighted, honored, because he served a purpose. And that blurred the line even further between piracy and war. Because if a government supports it, is it still piracy? Or is it strategy? The answer depends on where you stand. But for the men at sea, the reality was the same. Ships attacked, cargo taken, lives risked. Because regardless of legality, the act itself does not change. Across the Caribbean, Maori men followed this path, some with official backing, some without, some starting as privateers, and becoming full pirates once controls slipped away. Because once a man learns how to take, it becomes difficult to return to restraint. And the Caribbean began to fill with them. Islands that were once quiet became gathering points, places to rest, to repair ships, to divide spoils, places outside strict control. Because empires cannot watch every shoreline, and pirates find the ones that are not watched. The geography of the region helped them. Shallow waters that large naval ships struggled to navigate. Hidden inlets where small vessels could disappear. Endless routes that could be changed at a moment's notice. And within that complexity, piracy flourished. But this was not the romantic version that would come later. This was harsh, unstable, dangerous in ways that left little room for survival. Men turned on each other. Crews fractured. Alliances broke. Because piracy at this stage was still evolving, still finding structure, still adapting to a world that was becoming larger and more connected. But one thing was becoming clear. The sea was no longer just a place of movement. It was a battleground, not always declared, not always visible, but constant, because wealth was moving across it in ways never seen before. And wherever wealth moves, conflict follows. The Spanish tried to protect their fleets. Convoys, armed escorts, structured routes. But protection creates predictability. And predictability creates vulnerability. Because pirates do not need to attack everywhere. They only need to find one weakness, one gap, one moment where defense fails. And that moment always exists. Across Europe, Maori men were drawn to the sea, not for exploration, not for trade, but for opportunity outside the law. Because piracy offered something rare. Freedom, not safe freedom, not stable freedom, but freedom from structure, from hierarchy, from systems that controlled every aspect of life on land. At sea, a man could rise through action, through strength, through skill, not through birth, not through status. And that idea was powerful, even dangerous, because it attracted those who had nothing to lose. And those are the most unpredictable of all. The age of exploration continued. Routes expanded. Empires grew. But alongside them, so did piracy, not as a shadow, but as a parallel system, feeding off the same movement, the same wealth, the same vulnerability. And with each passing year, it became more organized, more structured, more defined, because chaos alone cannot sustain itself forever. It must evolve, and piracy was about to evolve into something far more recognizable, something more structured, more dangerous, more infamous. The foundations had been laid, the roots established, the wealth flowing, and the men willing to take it were already gathering. The next phase was not coming. It had already begun. The sea was no longer just opportunity. It was becoming identity. Because by now, piracy was no longer scattered instinct. It was gathering into something more defined, more deliberate, more permanent. Across the Caribbean, men were no longer simply attacking ships and disappearing. They were staying, settling, building lives around the act of taking. And when that happens, piracy stops being an event and becomes a system. It began quietly, not with declarations, not with structure, but with necessity. Ships needed repair. Crews needed rest. Supplies needed replenishing. And the sea does not provide those things. Land does. So pirates began to gather on islands, places just outside the full control of empires, places where authority was weak or absent entirely. One of the earliest centers of this shift was Hispaniola, a land divided, claimed by empires, but not fully controlled by either. And in that gap, a new kind of pirate began to form. They were not born pirates, not at first. They were hunters, living off the land, surviving by skill, by patience, By necessity, they hunted wild cattle, smoked the meat, sold it to passing ships, and for a time, that was enough. But proximity changes things, because when you live near wealth long enough, you begin to notice its patterns. Ships arriving regularly, cargo moving predictably, opportunities appearing again, and again, and again, and eventually, observation becomes temptation. These hunters became something else. Not overnight, but gradually. They began to board ships, at first to trade, then to take more than agreed, then to take everything. And from that shift, the buccaneers were born, men of the Caribbean, shaped by survival, driven by opportunity. Their name came from their past, from the way they smoked meat. But their future would be defined by something far different. Taking. They were not disciplined soldiers. Not yet. Not organized fleets. But they were learning. Because piracy at this stage was evolving quickly. Every success taught something. Every failure removed the weak. And what remained became sharper, more efficient, more dangerous. They learned how to move silently, how to approach ships without detection, how to strike at the right moment. Because timing is everything at sea. Too early, and you are seen. Too late, and the target escapes. But perfect timing turns weakness into victory. The buccaneers were not alone. Across the Caribbean, Maori groups were forming. Some former sailors, some escaped laborers, some criminals fleeing law, some simply men who chose the sea over land. Because land had rules, the sea had chances, and chance, for the right kind of person, is enough. But as piracy grew, so did the response. Empires could not ignore it forever. Spain especially, whose treasure fleets moved through these waters constantly. They strengthened defenses, increased patrols, fortified ports, but control in the Caribbean was never complete, because geography worked against it. Too many islands, too many routes, too many places to hide. And pirates used all of them. They learned the currents, the winds, the shallow waters where larger ships could not follow. They turned the environment itself into an advantage. Because piracy is not just about strength. It is about understanding the space you operate in better than anyone else. And they did. The buccaneers began to work together, not as a formal alliance, but as shared purpose. They attacked ships, raided coastal settlements, captured supplies, and divided the spoils, roughly, sometimes violently, because structure was still forming, still unstable, still dangerous. Trust was limited, because betrayal at sea is often fatal. But even in that instability, something new was emerging. A kind of brotherhood, not based on law, but on shared risk, shared reward, shared survival. Because at sea, no one survives alone for long. And slowly, rules began to appear, not written, not enforced by authority, but understood. Shares divided among crew, compensation for injury, agreements on leadership. Because even pirates need structure, not for morality, but for survival. And this was the beginning of something larger. Because once rules exist, even informally, a system begins to form, and systems grow. The Caribbean became more than just a region. It became a network, a web of movement, pirate ships traveling between islands, information spreading quickly, targets identified, routes shared, and within that network, piracy became more efficient than ever before. But with efficiency comes attention, and attention from empires means conflict. Spain continued to resist. England and France quietly encouraged, because weakening Spain meant strengthening themselves. And piracy was the perfect tool. Unofficial, deniable, effective. So the line between pirate and privateer blurred even further. Some buccaneers were given permission to attack Spanish ships. Others acted independently. But the result was the same. Spanish power in the Caribbean weakened, and piracy grew stronger, more confident, more organized, more visible. But visibility brings risk, because once something becomes large enough, it cannot hide anymore. And once it cannot hide, it becomes a target. The buccaneers were no longer just scattered raiders. They were becoming something closer to a force. Not yet unified, not yet controlled, but undeniable. And as they grew, so did the need for something more. More structure, more leadership, more identity. Because chaos alone cannot sustain growth forever. It must evolve or collapse. And piracy was about to evolve again into something even more recognizable. Something that would define the image of pirates for centuries to come. The age of scattered raiders was ending. The age of legends was beginning. There are moments in history when something hidden becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, it can never return to the shadows. In the Caribbean, piracy had reached that point. It was no longer scattered, no longer quiet, no longer something empires could ignore. It had become presence, and presence demands response. Across the islands, the network of raiders had grown into something larger. Ships moved not just randomly, but with intention. Information traveled faster than before. Targets were chosen, not stumbled upon. And within that growing system, certain places began to stand out. Places where pirates did not just pass through, but stayed, gathered, lived. And one place, above all others, would become something more than a refuge. It would become a symbol, a center, a statement. That place was Nassau. At first, it was nothing extraordinary. A small settlement, lightly defended, easily overlooked by major powers focused elsewhere. But that was exactly what made it perfect. Because pirates do not choose the strongest place. They choose the least controlled. And Nassau was barely controlled at all. As ships arrived, as crews needed rest, as stolen goods needed dividing, Nassau became a gathering point, not by design, but by accumulation. One crew stayed, then another, until eventually, it was no longer just a stop. It was a base, and once a base exists, a system begins to form around it. Pirates repaired ships there, shared information, recruited new crew members, divided treasure, and for the first time, they were not constantly moving. They had a place, and that changed everything. Because movement creates isolation, but settlement creates connection, and connection creates structure. Slowly, without formal declaration, Nassau became something no empire had planned for. A pirate stronghold, a place where authority was not just weak, but absent. And in that absence, something unexpected emerged. Not chaos, not total disorder, but a different kind of order. Because even pirates made rules, not laws imposed from above, but agreements formed from necessity. Leadership began to take shape. Not kings, not governors, but captains chosen by their crews. Because at sea, authority must be earned, not inherited. If a captain failed, he could be replaced. If he led poorly, he could be removed. Because survival depends on competence, not status. And that idea was dangerous, not just to empires, but to the structure of society itself. Because in Nassau, men who had nothing on land could gain power, respect, wealth, through action, through decision, through risk. And that created something rare, a form of equality, born not from idealism, but from necessity. Each crew developed its own rules, its own agreements, how treasure would be divided, how decisions would be made, what would happen in conflict. And while these rules were not perfect, they were functional, because they were built by those who lived under them, not imposed from outside. And that made them strong. For a time, because no system built on risk can remain stable forever. But for now, it worked. Ships sailed out from Nassau, not as isolated raiders, but as part of something larger, a loose network, a shared identity. Pirates, not just as a description, but as a role. And with that identity came reputation, because fear spreads faster than ships. Stories of pirate attacks reached far beyond the Caribbean. Merchants spoke of sudden raids, of ships appearing without warning, of crews overwhelmed before they could respond. And those stories grew, because fear does not remain accurate. It expands, exaggerates, transforms. Pirates became larger than life, more brutal, more unstoppable, because perception matters. And fear is a weapon. Some pirates understood that better than others. They dressed differently, acted deliberately, used intimidation as strategy. Because if a target surrenders without resistance, the risk disappears. And piracy is always about managing risk. But as reputation grew, so did attention. Empires could no longer ignore Nassau, could no longer dismiss piracy as isolated incidents. Because now, it was organized, visible, expanding. Spain was already weakened by years of attacks. But now England and other powers faced a choice: continue allowing piracy to serve their interests, or confront the fact that it had grown beyond control. Because what begins as a tool can become a threat, and piracy was becoming exactly that. Ships were no longer just attacking enemies. They attacked anyone Because once you remove law, target becomes opportunity, not allegiance. And that made pirates unpredictable, dangerous not just to rivals, but to everyone. And unpredictability is something empires cannot tolerate. So the response began to build. Slowly, quietly, but deliberately. Plans were formed, naval forces prepared, strategies discussed, because dismantling piracy at this scale would require more than reaction. It would require intention. But in Nassau, none of that was felt yet, because from the inside, the system still worked. Pirates lived freely, shared wealth, operated outside control. And for many, it felt like something close to independence. Not safe, not stable, but free. And freedom, even dangerous freedom, is powerful. It attracts more. More ships, more crews, more men willing to risk everything. Because the alternative, life under strict control, was not appealing to those who had already stepped outside it. And so Nassau grew, not in size alone, but in meaning. It became more than a place. It became an idea that the sea could belong to those bold enough to take it, that law could be ignored, that systems could be bypassed, that power could be taken, not granted. But ideas like that do not exist without consequence, because the larger they grow, the more they threaten everything built against them. And when that threat becomes too large, it is answered, not with negotiation, not with compromise, but with force. The golden age of piracy had begun, but so had its countdown. Every system built on freedom eventually meets the reality of its limits. In the Caribbean, that reality was beginning to take shape, not as collapse, not yet, but as pressure. Pressure from outside, pressure from within. Because Nassau was no longer just a refuge. It was a statement, and statements challenge power. Across the Atlantic, empires were watching, not casually, not distantly, but carefully, because what had once been useful was now dangerous. Piracy had served its purpose. It had weakened rivals, disrupted trade, shifted balance. But now, it was no longer controlled. And uncontrolled power is threat, not tool. In England, discussions began to change tone. Less tolerance, more concern, because pirate ships were no longer targeting only enemies. They attacked anyone, merchant vessels, neutral traders, even ships connected to those who once supported them. And that broke the unspoken agreement, because piracy was only acceptable as long as it remained selective. But pirates do not remain selective forever, because once wealth becomes the goal, allegiance fades, opportunity replaces loyalty. And Nassau, at the center of it all, became the focus, a place that needed to be addressed. Not ignored, not tolerated, but confronted. Meanwhile, inside Nassau, the world felt different. Not like rebellion, not like chaos, but like independence. Pirates lived by their own rules, chose their own leaders, shared their own wealth. And for many, it felt like something close to equality. Because at sea, A man's value was measured differently, not by birth, not by status, but by action, by skill, by courage. And that created a system unlike anything on land. Crews voted on decisions. Captains could be challenged. Leadership was conditional, not absolute, because absolute power at sea leads to failure, and failure leads to death. So balance was necessary, even among pirates. But balance does not mean stability, because the system depended on constant success, constant flow of wealth, constant victories. And when those slow down, tension rises, disputes increase, trust weakens, because piracy does not create security. It creates temporary advantage. And temporary advantage is not enough to sustain peace. Across the Caribbean, pirate crews began to grow bolder, more aggressive, more visible. They attacked larger ships, took bigger risks, pushed boundaries, because success builds confidence, and confidence often ignores limits, but limits always exist, and they were approaching. At sea, new figures began to emerge, not just captains, but personalities, men who understood something beyond strategy, something beyond survival. They understood fear, because fear travels faster than ships, and fear can win battles before they begin. Among these figures, one name began to spread more than others. Not quietly, not gradually, but rapidly. A man who did not just act like a pirate, but became something larger. A symbol, a presence, a story that grew as quickly as it moved. That man was Blackbeard. He did not invent piracy. He did not begin the system, but he understood it in a way few others did. Because piracy is not just about taking. It is about perception. And perception can be controlled. Blackbeard did not rely only on strength. He relied on image, on presence, on intimidation. He made himself appear larger than life, more dangerous than reality. Because if an enemy believes you cannot be defeated, they often do not try. He used smoke, fire, dark clothing, a presence designed to overwhelm before a single strike was made. And it worked. Ships surrendered without fighting. Crews abandoned resistance, because fear replaced logic. And fear is efficient. But Blackbeard was not alone. He was part of a growing network of pirates, each with their own approach. Some relied on speed, some on stealth, some on brutality, but all of them benefited from the same system, the same freedom, the same lack of control. And that system was beginning to reach its peak, because everything that grows rapidly eventually attracts resistance, and resistance was forming, not as scattered responses, but as coordinated effort. Empires began to act together, not out of unity, but out of necessity, because piracy now threatened all of them. Trade was being disrupted too widely. Losses were increasing. Confidence in sea travel was weakening. And that could not continue. So plans were made. Governors appointed. Naval forces prepared. Because dismantling piracy required more than ships. It required strategy, understanding, patience, Because pirates are not armies. They do not fight directly. They move. They adapt. They disappear. And to defeat that, you must think differently. But in Nassau, none of that felt immediate. Because from within, the system still worked. Ships still returned with treasure. Crews still celebrated success. Life continued. Because danger is often invisible until it arrives. And by the time it arrives, it is already too late to ignore. Blackbeard continued to grow in reputation, not just as a pirate, but as a force, a symbol of what piracy had become. Bold, fearless, uncontrolled, and symbols always attract attention because they represent something larger than themselves. And when that something threatens power, power responds. The golden age of piracy was reaching its height. But height is always followed by descent, because nothing built on instability remains stable forever. And the sea, which had allowed piracy to grow, was about to witness its first real attempt at destruction. Not suppression, not tolerance, but removal. And when empires decide to remove something, they do not act slowly. They act completely. But pirates would not disappear quietly. Power does not tolerate rivals for long, especially not ones it did not create. Across the Atlantic, the mood had changed. Not gradually, but decisively. Piracy was no longer useful. It was no longer strategic. It was a problem. And problems at this scale are not ignored. They are removed. In England, a decision formed. Clear, direct, irreversible. The Caribbean would be taken back. Not negotiated, not influenced, but controlled. And at the center of that effort, a new figure emerged. Not a pirate, not a soldier alone, but something more precise. A man sent not just to fight piracy, but to end it. Woodes Rogers. He understood something important. That piracy was not just a collection of criminals. It was a system. And systems cannot be destroyed by force alone. They must be broken from within. Rogers arrived in the Bahamas. Not quietly, not uncertainly, but with intention, with authority, with a plan already forming. Because Nassau was not just a location. It was the heart. And if the heart falls, the body weakens. But he did not begin with violence. Not immediately. Because he knew something pirates did not expect. That many of them did not want to die. They wanted freedom, wealth, escape, but not execution. And so, he offered something unexpected. A pardon, forgiveness, a chance to leave piracy behind, to return to lawful life, to survive. For some, this was enough, because piracy had always been dangerous, temporary, unstable, and the offer of safety was powerful. Crews fractured. Some accepted. Some hesitated. Some refused completely. Because not all pirates are the same. Some are driven by survival. Others by identity. And those who build their identity around piracy do not abandon it easily. Because leaving piracy is not just changing profession. It is changing self. And that is far more difficult. In Nassau, The reaction was immediate. Confusion, division, uncertainty, because the system that had felt stable was now being challenged from within. Some captains accepted the pardon, lowered their flags, surrendered, hoping for a future beyond the sea. Others saw it as weakness, betrayal, an attempt to dismantle everything they had built. And tensions spread, not quietly, but openly, because when a system fractures, conflict follows. And while this division unfolded, Rogers prepared for the next step. Because the pardon alone was not enough. It was a tool, not a solution. Those who refused would face something else. Wars, naval ships began to arrive. Not scattered, but coordinated. Not reacting, but advancing. Because this was no longer about control. It was about removal. Pirate strongholds were targeted. Ships hunted. Leaders identified. And slowly, the pressure began to build. Across the Caribbean, pirates realized something had changed. This was not the same resistance as before. Not scattered patrols. Not isolated responses. This was organized, deliberate, relentless, and for the first time, the system that had allowed piracy to flourish began to collapse. Because piracy depends on space, on movement, on the ability to disappear. And when that space is reduced, when movement is restricted, when escape becomes uncertain, piracy weakens, but it does not end immediately. Because those who remain are the most committed, the most dangerous, the least willing to surrender. And amongst them, Blackbeard. Blackbeard. He did not accept the pardon. Not fully. Not in spirit. Because for him, piracy was not just opportunity. It was identity. He continued to operate, to raid, to move across the sea as if nothing had changed. But something had, because the environment itself was shifting. Less space, more patrols, more risk, even for someone like him. But Blackbeard adapted, as all successful pirates do. He changed routes, avoided heavily patrolled areas, used his reputation more than ever. Because fear still worked. Ships still surrendered. Crews still hesitated. And as long as that continued, he remained powerful. But power at this stage was temporary, because the system that supported it was being dismantled. Elsewhere, other pirates made different choices. Some attempted to continue as before, and were captured. Some resisted openly, and were hunted down. Some tried to disappear, to fade back into ordinary life. But the sea remembers, and so do empires. Because once a man is known as a pirate, he does not easily escape that identity. And for many, there was no return, only continuation or end. Nassau itself began to change. Under Rogers, order was reintroduced, fortifications strengthened, authority restored. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to break the system that had once existed. Because piracy does not survive in controlled environments. It needs gaps, and those gaps were closing. The Golden Age, which had risen so quickly, so powerfully, was now beginning to fall. Not in a single moment, not in a single battle, but in a series of decisions, actions, consequences. Because systems do not collapse instantly. They unravel, thread by thread, until nothing remains. And as the Caribbean shifted, as piracy lost its center, the sea itself began to feel different. Not safe, not peaceful, but changing. Because what had once been uncontrolled was now being contested, actively, relentlessly, and pirates, who had once thrived in freedom, now faced something they had avoided for so long. Constraint. And constraint is something piracy cannot survive forever. But before it disappeared, it would resist, violently, unpredictably, completely, because those who have lived without limits do not accept them quietly. The sea does not forget change, but it never announces it either. It simply shifts until nothing feels the same anymore. Across the Caribbean, that shift was now unavoidable. Piracy was no longer expanding. It was being pressed, cornered, contained, not in one place, but everywhere at once. Because once a system is identified, it can be targeted. And once it is targeted, it begins to shrink. The era of open movement was ending. And what replaced it was pursuit. Ships that once sailed freely between islands now moved cautiously. Routes that once felt safe now felt exposed. And pirates who once controlled the water through presence now had to rely on evasion. Because the sea was no longer empty between empires. It was watched, constantly, methodically, and at the center of this transformation, the pressure focused on individuals, not just crews, not just ships, but names, because empires do not fight systems forever. They isolate symbols, and one symbol had become impossible to ignore. Blackbeard. He was no longer just a pirate among others. He was a representation of everything piracy had become. Bold, visible, defiant, and visibility is dangerous, because the more you are seen, the less you can disappear. Blackbeard continued to move through the waters, but the environment around him had changed completely. Naval patrols increased, coordination improved, information spread faster, and the element that piracy depended on most, surprise, was shrinking. Still, he adapted, because survival at sea is never static. It is constant adjustment. He avoided predictable routes, used intimidation more than engagement, and continued to rely on reputation. That invisible weapon that often works before a ship is even seen. Because fear travels ahead of reality, and many ships surrendered without a fight. But even fear has limits, because fear depends on uncertainty, and uncertainty fades when control increases. Across the Caribbean, the campaign against piracy intensified, not in scattered attempts, but in coordinated pressure. Governors communicated, naval commanders shared intelligence, ships worked in networks instead of isolation. And that alone changed everything, because pirates had always relied on fragmentation, on the inability of empires to act together. But now, that weakness was being repaired. Slowly, carefully, and effectively. Some pirates tried to resist the shift. Others tried to adapt. Many simply disappeared, fading into obscurity or surrendering quietly under pardons that still lingered from earlier efforts. Because not all pirates were committed ideologically. Many were opportunists. And when opportunity declines, so does participation. But the most committed, the most dangerous, did not vanish. They reacted. And reaction often leads to confrontation. Blackbeard became more elusive. Not weaker, but more cautious. He avoided large engagements, focused on smaller targets, moved frequently, because when pressure increases, mobility becomes survival. But even mobility has limits. When every direction is being watched. Elsewhere, the remaining pirate strongholds weakened. Supply lines broke down. Crew morale fractured. Because piracy is not just action. It is sustainability. And sustainability requires success. Without consistent success, piracy becomes risk without reward. And risk without reward collapses quickly. Nassau had already fallen under stronger control earlier, but its influence still lingered in memory. The idea that pirates could control territory had already been broken. Now, even the idea of free movement was being challenged, because the sea was no longer a space of gaps. It was becoming a space of coverage. And coverage kills piracy, not instantly, but inevitably. Still, the end of piracy does not come quietly, because those who remain are not average sailors. They are survivors, and survivors resist longer than systems expect. Some ships fought back aggressively, desperately, knowing surrender no longer guaranteed safety or freedom. Others attempted escape into deeper waters, further routes, unknown regions. But the world was no longer unknown in the same way. Maps had expanded, knowledge had spread, and isolation was harder to find. The golden age of piracy was now fully under pressure. Not collapsing yet, but clearly breaking. And within that breaking, moments of final confrontation began to emerge. Encounters that would define the end of an era. Because empires had learned something critical. Piracy is not defeated by ignoring it. It is defeated by removing its leaders, its symbols, its ability to inspire continuation. And so, the focus sharpened, narrowed, until it was no longer about piracy in general, but about individuals. Men who had become too visible to ignore, too influential to allow, too symbolic to survive. And Blackbeard was one of them. The sea that once allowed him to dominate through presence was now narrowing around him. Routes tightening, patrols closing in, time reducing, because the age where fear alone could control the ocean was ending. And what came next would be decided not by reputation, but by confrontation. Direct, final, unavoidable. The sea becomes quiet in a strange way, right before it turns violent. Not calm, not peaceful, but concentrated, as if everything that once moved freely is now being pulled toward a single point. Across the Caribbean, that point was forming, not as a place, but as pressure, because the hunt for piracy had stopped being general. It had become personal, focused, intentional, and in that shift, everything changed. The remaining pirate crews could feel it. Not through announcements, not through declarations, but through experience. Ships were being intercepted faster. Escape routes were closing. Patrol patterns were becoming predictable only to those who already understood them. And that meant one thing. The system had matured. It was no longer learning. It was executing. For pirates, that was the worst possible stage. Because chaos is survivable. Randomness is survivable. But organized pressure is not. At the center of this tightening world, one figure continued to move through it all. Still known, still feared, still pursued. Blackbeard. He was no longer operating in expansion. He was operating in survival. And those are very different states of mind. In expansion, every decision opens possibilities. In survival, every decision closes them. Blackbeard's movements became more controlled, more selective. He avoided unnecessary conflict, focused only on what ensured continuation. Because at this stage, every battle risked everything. And yet, he did not stop, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant the end of identity. But pressure does something to even the strongest systems. It forces mistakes. It narrows options. It reduces time. And time is the one resource no captain can recover. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, the remaining pirate networks began to fracture, not always from defeat, but from uncertainty. Crews no longer trusted each other as they once had, because survival under pressure creates suspicion. Who will flee? Who will betray? Who will accept pardon? Who will resist until the end? These questions replace strategy. And once trust disappears, structure follows quickly. Some pirates surrendered under royal pardons, choosing life over legacy. Others attempted to escape into quieter waters, fading toward obscurity. But the most committed, the most dangerous, the ones who had built identity around the sea, stayed and continued because they had nothing else left. And that makes them harder to predict, harder to control, harder to stop. The naval forces hunting them had also evolved. No longer scattered patrols, no longer reactive responses. They had become coordinated operations. Ships working together, information sharing across regions, commanders acting with shared intent. Because piracy had taught empires something important. Fragmentation allows survival. Coordination destroys it. And now, coordination was fully in place. Routes were monitored. Ports were secured. Signals were tracked. And escape routes were narrowing. The Caribbean was no longer a maze. It was becoming a net. And nets are designed for one purpose: capture. Blackbeard continued to move through this tightening structure. Still dangerous, still effective, but increasingly isolated. Because even fear begins to lose power when it is repeatedly challenged. Ships that once surrendered without question now hesitated, because hesitation returns when certainty weakens, and certainty weakens when control increases. Across the sea, a new reality was forming. Piracy was no longer dominant. It was reactive, no longer expanding, only surviving. And survival under pressure is unstable because it depends on constant success. One failure can end everything. One mistake can collapse years of reputation. And in this environment, even the most experienced pirates were vulnerable. Blackbeard's legend still held weight, but legends do not stop ships that no longer fear them. They only delay them. And delay eventually ends. The network that once supported piracy had largely dissolved. Nassau was already under control. Other strongholds had fallen or weakened. Communication between crews had broken down. And without communication, piracy loses coordination. And without coordination, it loses scale. What remained was fragmented, isolated, unpredictable, and unpredictable systems are easier to dismantle. The golden age that had once felt limitless was now visibly collapsing, not through one decisive moment, but through accumulated pressure. Because history rarely ends dramatically. It ends structurally, piece by piece, until the structure can no longer hold itself together. And at sea, that process was now complete. The pirates who remained were no longer part of a system. They were remnants, echoes of a larger age, still dangerous, but no longer dominant. And the forces hunting them knew it, which is why the focus sharpened further. Because when a system is close to collapse, the final steps matter most. Not everything must be destroyed. Only what remains of leadership. Only what still inspires continuation. And Blackbeard was still doing both. So the pursuit intensified. Routes narrowed further. Patrols became constant. And the ocean that once felt endless now felt smaller with every passing day. The age of freedom at sea was approaching its final moments. And what came next would not be a continuation of piracy, but its final confrontation. There are moments in history when pursuit stops feeling like movement and starts feeling like inevitability. In the Caribbean, that moment had arrived. Not loudly, not all at once, but with a quiet certainty that spread across the sea. Piracy was no longer being chased in general. It was being closed in on. And at the center of that closure was the last breath of its golden age. The ocean itself felt different now. Not calmer, but tighter, as if the space between ships had shrunk, as if every horizon was no longer open, but watched. And for those who lived by unpredictability, that change was fatal. Among them, one figure still stood out above the rest, not because he was the only pirate left, but because he refused to disappear. Blackbeard. By now, he was no longer simply raiding. He was navigating pressure itself. Every decision was survival. Every route was calculated. Every moment carried consequence. Because the world around him had changed faster than he had. Naval forces were no longer scattered. They were coordinated. Patrols were no longer occasional. They were continuous. And information no longer traveled slowly. It traveled ahead of him. The ocean had become a map drawn against him. Still, he moved, because stopping meant surrendering not just life, but identity. And pirates like him do not surrender identity easily. But even the strongest resistance cannot escape structure forever. The system hunting him had matured fully. Ships worked in alignment. Routes were anticipated. Ports were monitored. Escape paths were reduced not by force, but by coverage. And coverage is more effective than violence, because it leaves fewer options, not more conflict. Blackbeard adapted as he always had, shifting routes, avoiding predictable waters, relying on reputation where possible, and caution where necessary. But adaptation has limits, because every adjustment narrows future choices. And eventually, there is nowhere left to adjust. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, the remnants of piracy continued to dissolve, not in a single collapse, but in continuous fragmentation. Some crews accepted pardons offered earlier by Woodes Rogers, choosing survival over resistance. Others fled deeper into unknown waters, where control was weaker, but so was opportunity. And without opportunity, piracy loses its foundation. Because piracy is not sustained by ideology. It is sustained by reward. And when reward diminishes, so does participation. What remained were the most committed crews, the ones who could not return, the ones who would not surrender, and the ones who had become too tied to the sea to imagine land again. These were the final fragments of the Golden Age. Not organized, not unified, but still dangerous, because desperation sharpens action, and desperation removes hesitation. The naval forces pursuing them understood this, which is why the strategy had shifted again. No longer containment, no longer pressure, but conclusion. The objective was no longer to suppress piracy. It was to end its remaining symbols. Because systems do not die evenly. They die through focal points. And Blackbeard had become one of those points. Not by appointment, but by survival. Because he continued to resist when others fell away. Continued to operate when others surrendered. Continued to move when others disappeared. And in doing so, he became the final representation of an entire era. The sea around him tightened further. Routes narrowed. Patrols converged. Signals aligned. And the illusion of escape began to fade completely. Because at this stage, it was no longer about finding pirates. It was about enclosing them. And enclosure is only complete when there is nowhere left to go. Blackbeard's final movements were not dramatic. They were practical, measured, focused, because even legends behave differently when survival becomes immediate. He did not rely on fear alone anymore. He relied on positioning, on timing, on reading the sea as it closed around him. But even mastery of the sea cannot overcome a system designed to remove you. The Caribbean had become that system. Structured, coordinated, persistent, and every passing day reduced the space left to operate. Other pirates felt it too, the sense that the age had already ended, and they were simply moving through its aftermath. Some resisted until their final moments. Others vanished quietly, but none could restore what had already collapsed. Because piracy had depended on imbalance, and imbalance had been corrected. Slowly, systematically, completely. Now only remnants remained. And remnants do not define eras. They conclude them. The pursuit of Blackbeard intensified further, not as a chase anymore, but as convergence, multiple paths leading to one result, multiple ships moving toward one encounter, multiple decisions narrowing into a single point. And the sea, once infinite in possibility, now funneled everything toward closure. The golden age of piracy was no longer fading. It was ending, and what stood at its center was about to face the moment that would define its memory forever. Not just as a pirate, but as the final echo of an entire world that had once ruled the sea. The sea had always been open, but openness does not mean freedom. Not when every direction is being watched. Not when every route is being predicted. Not when every movement is being narrowed into possibility rather than choice. By this point, piracy was no longer a system. It was a condition under pressure, and pressure always seeks release. In the Caribbean, that release was approaching its final form. The remaining pirate crews were scattered now, not connected, not coordinated, not part of anything resembling the system that once ruled the waters. They still moved, but movement had changed meaning. It was no longer expansion. It was survival, and survival at sea is always temporary, because the ocean does not protect those who lose structure. It exposes them, one by one. Among those still active, fear remained, but it was different now. Not the fear they once inspired, but the fear they themselves felt, because the environment had turned against them. Patrols were no longer random. They were intentional. Ships no longer responded individually. They moved in alignment, and information no longer arrived late. It arrived first. This is what happens when control reaches maturity. The hunted begin to feel the shape of the hunt itself. And at the center of that tightening structure, Blackbeard continued to move. Blackbeard, not as a conqueror, not as a ruler, but as a man refusing disappearance. Every decision he made now was constrained. Routes were fewer, opportunities narrower, time shorter, because time is the first resource to collapse under pressure. And once time collapses, everything else follows. He was no longer operating in confidence. He was operating in calculation, avoiding detection where possible, using intimidation where effective, avoiding confrontation unless necessary, because confrontation now carried finality. There were no more second chances in these waters, only outcomes. Elsewhere, the remnants of piracy continued to dissolve under increasing pressure. Crews fractured further. Trust became unstable. And instability at sea is dangerous in ways that cannot be predicted. Some captains attempted to maintain cohesion. But cohesion requires stability. And stability had already been removed. Others accepted pardons that still lingered from earlier campaigns led by Woodes Rogers, choosing survival over legacy. But not all could make that choice, because identity is not always flexible. Some men could not imagine life beyond the sea, not because they were strong, but because they had become dependent on the structure piracy provided, even if that structure was violent, unstable, temporary. The system that once felt like freedom now felt like entrapment, because freedom without stability eventually becomes constraint. Across the Caribbean, the final phase of pursuit had begun. No longer expansion of control, but completion of it. Naval forces were no longer searching broadly. They were narrowing focus. Because when systems near collapse, the objective becomes singular. Remove what remains. And what remained was visible, not hidden, not anonymous, but known. Blackbeard had become more than a man. He had become a reference point, a name that represented the end of an era. And that made him unavoidable. Every movement he made was now tracked in relation to something larger. Not just piracy, but its conclusion. The ocean that once allowed endless escape now offered diminishing paths, because escape requires options, and options require space, and space was disappearing. The golden age of piracy was no longer being challenged. It was being finalized, and in that finalization, the remaining pirates began to realize something that changes everything. There would be no return to previous conditions, no restoration of old freedoms, no re-expansion of territory, only reduction, until nothing remained. Blackbeard continued to operate within this shrinking world. But even the most skilled navigator cannot redirect a system that has already closed around him. The sea itself felt different now, not calmer, but resolved, as if every current had already decided its direction, as if every wave carried consequence rather than possibility. And when the environment itself begins to feel final, the people within it become aware of their position in history, not as participants in expansion, but as the last points of resistance before closure. Other pirate groups felt it too, the sense that the age was no longer ongoing, but concluding. Some increased aggression in response. Others attempted escape routes farther and farther from traditional waters. But distance no longer guaranteed safety, because the system of pursuit had expanded beyond geography. It had become structure, and structure does not rely on distance. It relies on reach, and reach was now complete. The Caribbean had become a closed system, not fully sealed, but sufficiently controlled to determine outcomes. And within that controlled system, there was only one direction left for piracy to move, toward its final confrontation. Not gradual decline anymore, but defined end. Blackbeard's name continued to spread, not as rumor, but as inevitability, because when systems approach their conclusion, they are no longer unpredictable. They become historical, and history always completes itself. The sea changes its nature when escape is no longer possible. It stops being a path and becomes a stage. Every movement is seen. Every decision carries weight. Every horizon feels closer than it should. In the Caribbean, that transformation was complete now. Piracy no longer existed as a network. It existed as fragments. And fragments do not coordinate. They scatter. Some crews still fought the pressure, still tried to move like before, still believed in the old rhythm of the sea, where surprise could overturn power in an instant. But the system around them had already shifted beyond that logic. The hunt was no longer reactive. It was predictive. And prediction destroys piracy faster than any cannon ever could. Across the waters, naval forces moved with shared purpose. Not isolated ships anymore, but coordinated presence. Because isolation had once been the pirates' greatest advantage. Now coordination was theirs, and that reversal changed everything. For the remaining pirate crews, every decision felt narrower. Every route felt watched. Every safe harbor felt temporary. And trust, the most fragile currency at sea, was collapsing. Because when pressure increases, alliances break first. Not because of betrayal alone, but because survival becomes individual again. Some captains chose surrender under earlier pardons offered by Woodes Rogers. Returning to land, returning to law, returning to something stable enough to rebuild a life. Others refused entirely, not out of strategy, but identity, because for them, piracy was no longer a choice. It was who they had become. And identity is the hardest thing to abandon. But even identity bends under pressure. Some crews dissolved quietly, splitting apart without conflict. Others ended violently, turned inward when external escape disappeared. Because systems under collapse rarely end cleanly. They fracture, and within that fracture, individuals are forced into final positions. At the center of all this movement, Blackbeard remained. Blackbeard, no longer expanding influence, no longer building power, only maintaining presence. Because presence alone was now enough to define him. He understood what the sea had become. Not open, but narrowing. Not free, but structured against him. And still, he moved, not with confidence anymore, but with calculation shaped by necessity, avoiding predictable waters, watching patrol patterns, using fear when possible, because fear still worked in limited spaces. But even fear weakens when repetition builds resistance. And resistance was growing. The Caribbean had become a system that learned. And systems that learn do not revert. They tighten. They correct. They close. Other pirates noticed it too. Not all at once, but gradually, like pressure building in the water itself. Some responded with aggression, attempting bold raids to break momentum. But boldness without structure becomes exposure. Others tried evasion, fading into less traveled routes. But fewer routes remained unknown now. Maps had expanded, knowledge had spread, and isolation had been reduced to fragments. The golden age of piracy, which had once felt limitless, now existed only as memory inside those still living it. And memories are not enough to sustain systems, because systems require continuity. And continuity was breaking. Within this collapsing environment, every remaining pirate became more visible, not because they wanted to be, but because there was nowhere left to disappear. And visibility is the final stage before confrontation. Blackbeard's reputation still carried weight, but weight alone does not stop pursuit. It only delays it. And delays in this phase were shrinking. Naval forces now moved with a single objective in mind. Not disruption, not suppression, but completion. Because empires do not end conflicts halfway. They end them fully. And piracy was now in its final phase of being ended. Not through a single battle, but through convergence. Paths narrowing into one another. Routes intersecting. Movements aligning toward contact. The sea itself felt like it was getting outcomes now. Not random, not chaotic, but directed by the structure that had been built around it. Even pirates could feel it. That sense that history was no longer something they were part of, but something that was closing around them. And in that closing, there is no expansion left, only final encounters. Blackbeard continued forward, not unaware, but unwilling to stop moving, because stopping meant surrender to a system already designed to end him. And pirates like him do not stop easily, but even resistance has a limit, and that limit was approaching faster than any of them could reverse. The Golden Age was no longer declining. It was resolving, and resolution always requires an endpoint. There is a silence that comes before closure. Not peaceful, not calm, but compressed, as if the world itself is holding its breath. In the Caribbean, that silence was everywhere now. Between islands, between ships, between decisions. Piracy had not vanished, but it had stopped expanding. And when something stops expanding, it begins to contract. Not all at once, but inevitably. The remaining pirate crews were no longer connected by structure. They were connected only by memory. Memory of how the sea once felt. Open, uncontrolled, responsive to boldness rather than system. But memory cannot compete with enforcement. And enforcement had arrived fully. Naval coordination had reached its most efficient form. Ships moved in patterns that mirrored intelligence rather than reaction. Routes were no longer guessed. They were anticipated. And anticipation is the most dangerous enemy of unpredictability. Because pirates depend on surprise, on absence, on gaps, and gaps were disappearing. Everywhere, at the center of this narrowing world, Blackbeard still moved through the sea. Blackbeard, but movement no longer meant freedom. It meant survival under observation. Every choice was constrained by awareness that he was no longer unseen. He was being measured, tracked, expected. And when a man becomes expected, he loses advantage. Still, he adapted, because adaptation is the final skill of survival. He changed routes frequently, avoided predictable ports, relied on intimidation where opportunity allowed, because fear still functioned, but only in moments where contact happened before resistance. And those moments were shrinking. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, what remained of piracy continued to fragment. Crews that once operated together now separated into smaller units. Not because they wanted to, but because cohesion had become impossible under pressure. Trust broke first, then communication, then shared action. And without those three things, a system collapses faster than it builds. Some pirates accepted earlier pardons offered under Woodes Rogers, returning to controlled society, trying to rebuild lives outside the sea. But return is never simple, because once a person has lived outside law, they never fully return to it. Others refused entirely, choosing continuation over survival. But continuation under diminishing structure becomes isolation, and isolation is where final confrontations are born. Across the waters, the final net was closing, not metaphorically, but operationally. Patrol routes overlapped, communication lines synchronized, ships reinforced each other instead of acting alone. And this coordination removed the last advantage pirates had ever relied on: fragmentation of authority. Now there was none, only unified pressure. And pressure does not need to search. It only needs to converge. The Caribbean had become a system designed to end itself in a controlled way. Not chaotic destruction, but structured closure. Pirates could feel it, not in one moment, but continuously, in the narrowing of options, in the shortening of safe travel windows, in the increasing likelihood of interception. Even the ocean currents felt less like escape routes, and more like guided paths toward encounter. And in this environment, Blackbeard's position became increasingly defined, not as a threat at large, but as a point of resolution, because systems nearing completion focus on endpoints, not distribution, and he had become one of those endpoints. His name no longer represented danger alone. It represented conclusion, the last visible echo of a collapsing age. He was no longer part of the golden age of piracy. He was what remained after it. And what remains after an age is always smaller than what it was. Still, he continued, because pirates like him do not operate on probability anymore. They operate on refusal. Refusal to accept reduction. Refusal to accept disappearance. Refusal to accept that the sea they once ruled no longer behaves the same way. But refusal cannot restore structure. It can only delay its consequences. Across the Caribbean, other pirate remnants met their ends in smaller, quieter ways. Some intercepted without resistance. Some destroyed in brief engagements. Some simply disappeared into the vastness of changing waters. Because when a system collapses, not everything falls at once, but everything falls eventually. And the system of piracy had already passed its point of stability. Only final movements remained. And final movements are always simple. They converge. Blackbeard continued moving through tightening waters, unaware of nothing, but unable to reverse direction of the system around him. Because at this stage, direction is no longer personal. It is structural, and structure does not negotiate. It completes. The sea itself felt like it was guiding everything toward a single, unavoidable point. Not through intention, but through closure of alternatives. And when alternatives disappear, outcomes become fixed. The golden age of piracy was no longer ending slowly. It was finishing. And what defines endings like this is not what survives, but what is no longer allowed to continue. By now, the sea no longer felt like distance. It felt like pressure. Every horizon tighter than the last. Every route carrying less possibility than before. Every decision narrowing into consequence. The Caribbean had become something very different from what it once was. Not a playground of ships. Not a battlefield of opportunists. But a structured environment closing itself around a disappearing age. Piracy had not been erased yet, but it had been reduced to fragments. And fragments cannot hold power for long. They only delay disappearance. Across the water, naval coordination had reached its final form. Not scattered responses, not regional attempts, but unified enforcement. Ships worked in alignment. Routes were shared. Targets were anticipated before contact. And that changed everything. because pirates had always relied on unpredictability, on gaps in communication, on distance between authority. Now those gaps were gone, and without gaps, there is no piracy system left, only individuals trying to survive inside structure. At this stage, even the ocean seemed different. Currents no longer felt like escape. They felt like guidance toward inevitability. Ports that once offered refuge now carried risk. Islands that once meant safety now felt observed. And silence between ships was no longer calm. It was anticipation. Among those still moving through this narrowing world, Blackbeard remained. Blackbeard, not as expansion, not as dominance, but as persistence. A man continuing forward through a system designed to reduce him to history. He understood the situation better than most. The sea was no longer open. It was structured, patrolled, anticipated. And in that structure, there was less room with every passing day. He adapted as he always had. Changed routes, avoided known patrol concentrations, used intimidation where contact could not be avoided. Because fear still worked, but only in moments where resistance had no time to form. And those moments were disappearing. Elsewhere, the remaining pirate crews were breaking apart completely. Not always through battle, often through exhaustion. Because long-term pressure does not always destroy instantly. It drains. First trust, then coordination, then identity. Some crews accepted pardons offered under Woodes Rogers, returning to controlled ports, trying to rebuild lives under law after years outside it. But return is never clean, because once a person has lived outside structure, structure always feels different afterward. Others refused entirely, continuing into deeper waters. Further isolation, smaller and smaller movements across a shrinking map. But isolation is not safety when surveillance expands. It is only delay. And delays in this phase are temporary at best. Across the Caribbean, the final phase of closure was underway. Not chaos, not scattered pursuit, but convergence, routes narrowing, patrols overlapping, signals shared across entire regions. Because empires had learned something critical. Piracy does not end through encounters alone. It ends through removal of mobility. And mobility was now restricted everywhere. The Caribbean had become a controlled system. Not perfectly sealed, but sufficiently structured that outcomes were predictable. And when outcomes become predictable, history moves toward completion. Blackbeard's presence within this system had become more defined with each passing movement. Not as a threat expanding outward, but as a point everything was moving toward. Because systems under closure always identify endpoints. And he had become one of them. Not by choice, but by persistence. He had remained visible when others disappeared. Active when others surrendered, mobile when others fractured. And in doing so, he became symbolic, not just of piracy, but of its final resistance. And symbols do not survive systems designed to end them. They are resolved. Across the sea, encounters began to form not as chance, but as structure. Naval forces closing distances, pirate movements constrained by shrinking options, routes intersecting more frequently, until movement itself began to feel like guidance toward confrontation. The sea that once allowed infinite escape now funneled everything toward fewer and fewer points. And those points were no longer random. They were final. Blackbeard continued forward, not unaware, but unable to reverse the momentum around him. Because at this stage, momentum belongs to the system, not the individual, and systems do not negotiate with individuals. They conclude them. Other pirate remnants met their ends in smaller moments across the Caribbean. Some in brief engagements, some through interception, some simply fading as coordination collapsed completely. Because when structure disappears, what remains cannot sustain itself. The golden age of piracy had already passed its functional limit. What remained now was resolution, and resolution does not expand. It converges. Everything in the Caribbean now pointed toward that convergence. Not dramatically, but structurally. And in structure, there is no escape path left unaccounted for. Only the final narrowing. And what lies at the end of narrowing systems is always the same. An end that has already been decided by everything that came before it. The sea at its end does not feel empty. It feels finished. Not calm in a peaceful sense, but resolved as if every current has already chosen where it must go. Across the Caribbean, that sense of resolution had arrived. The golden age of piracy was no longer fading. It had already faded. What remained now was only its last movement through history. Fragmented crews, isolated ships, names that once carried weight across oceans, now reduced to echoes moving through narrowing waters. The system that had once allowed piracy to flourish had been fully replaced. Not by chance, but by structure. Coordinated naval patrols, shared intelligence across empires, routes monitored with precision that had never existed before. The sea was no longer open space between powers. It was an organized environment. And within that environment, piracy could no longer grow, only be concluded. At the center of this final convergence stood the last figure still resisting disappearance. Blackbeard. He was not expanding. He was not building. He was not leading an era anymore. He was surviving its collapse. Every movement now carried the weight of finality. Every decision shaped by awareness that space itself had become limited. The freedom that once defined his existence had narrowed into constraint. Still, he moved, because men like him do not stop while options remain, even when those options are only temporary extensions of inevitability. The waters he once dominated through reputation alone no longer responded the same way. Fear still existed, but it was no longer absolute, because fear depends on uncertainty, and uncertainty had been reduced by coordination. Ships no longer acted alone. They supported each other. They anticipated rather than reacted. And anticipation removes the advantage of reputation. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, what remained of piracy continued to dissolve. Some crews accepted earlier pardons under Woodes Rogers, returning to controlled ports and attempting to rebuild lives under law. But return was never complete, because once a life is lived outside structure, structure always feels different afterward. Others refused entirely, choosing isolation over surrender, disappearing into smaller waters. Smaller routes, smaller opportunities. But even isolation was no longer protection, because the system had expanded beyond geography. It was now operational, coordinated, persistent, and there were no gaps left unobserved. The Caribbean had become a closed environment, not sealed, but controlled enough that outcomes were no longer uncertain. And when outcomes are no longer uncertain, history begins to finalize itself. Blackbeard's presence within this system had become unavoidable, not because he was the strongest remaining pirate, but because he was the most visible continuation of what piracy had been. He represented not the beginning, but the end. And endings do not require many points of focus. Only one. Across the sea, naval forces converged with increasing precision, not searching broadly anymore, but narrowing intentionally, because systems under completion do not scatter effort. They concentrated. Routes overlapped, patrols aligned, movement patterns predicted and countered, and the ocean itself no longer offered ambiguity. It offered direction toward closure. Blackbeard moved through this narrowing world, aware that nothing around him functioned as it once had. But awareness does not always create alternatives. Sometimes it only confirms limits. He continued to rely on what had always worked for him. Adaptation, intimidation, mobility. But even those tools lose strength when the environment itself becomes structured against them. Because piracy had always depended on imbalance, and imbalance no longer existed. Every remaining pirate encounter across the Caribbean followed the same pattern. Short engagements, rapid breakdowns, or surrender without resistance. Not because courage had disappeared, but because structure had replaced unpredictability. And without unpredictability, piracy cannot function. It can only conclude. Blackbeard's final movements were not extraordinary in isolation. They were part of a pattern that had already formed across the sea. A final tightening, a final reduction, a final convergence of all remaining instability into defined outcome. The golden age of piracy did not end in one moment. It ended in alignment, every fragment of it being brought into contact with the system that replaced it. And once alignment is complete, nothing remains unaccounted for. What once felt infinite had become finite. What once felt uncontrollable had become structured. What once felt like freedom had become memory. And within that transformation, piracy ceased to exist as a system. Only its final echoes remained. Blackbeard was one of those echoes, not as legend yet, not as myth, but as the final point through which an entire era would be remembered. Because history does not preserve everything equally. It preserves endpoints. And he had become one. The sea continued moving after him, as it always does. But it no longer carried the same meaning. It was no longer a space of expansion for piracy. It was a space that had already completed its correction. And when correction is complete, what follows is not repetition. It is memory. And memory is where the age of piracy now belonged. After an age ends, the world does not feel different immediately. It simply stops behaving the same way. The Caribbean, now stripped of its former instability, entered that strange in-between state where change has already happened, but memory still lingers as if it hasn't. Ships moved with more certainty. Trade routes stabilized. Ports that once lived under constant threat began to function under routine. And slowly, the sea stopped feeling like an unpredictable force. It became regulated space. Not safe, but structured. For those who had lived through piracy's peak, this shift felt unnatural, as if something essential had been removed from the ocean itself. Because piracy had not just been an activity, it had been a rhythm, a pressure within the system of trade and empire. And now that pressure was gone, leaving only balance in its place. Across the remaining waters, the last fragments of pirate resistance continued to vanish. Some through capture, some through surrender, some through disappearance into obscurity, but none through continuation as they once were. Because continuity requires structure, and structure no longer existed for them. It had been replaced, not by chaos, but by enforcement. The transformation was complete. And within that completed transformation, figures like Blackbeard no longer existed as active forces in the present, only as converging endpoints in memory. Blackbeard had moved through the final phase of a world that no longer supported him. Every instinct he used, every adaptation he relied on, had once been effective because the environment allowed it. But environments change faster than individuals. And when they do, even mastery becomes limited. The sea around him was no longer the same world that had created him. It had become something structured against the very logic that allowed piracy to thrive. Controlled routes, coordinated patrols, shared intelligence, reduced uncertainty. And in that environment, even the most dangerous figures lose their advantage. Because piracy was never about strength alone. It was about exploiting gaps. And the gaps were gone. Elsewhere, the last pirate groups dissolved into historical remnants. Some accepted reintegration under systems established by Woodes Rogers, attempting to rebuild lives within lawful order. But reintegration is never complete, because experience leaves marks that systems cannot erase. Others drifted into obscurity, names lost to records, crews forgotten except in scattered reports and maritime logs. Because once a system ends, it does not preserve all its participants equally. It compresses them into narrative. And narrative simplifies complexity. What once was thousands of individuals becomes a handful of remembered names. The Caribbean itself now reflected that change. The waters still moved. The currents still shifted. But the meaning had changed entirely. No longer a contested space of empires and opportunists. It had become a regulated corridor of commerce. The transformation was not dramatic. It was structural. And structural change is permanent in ways violence is not. Because violence ends events. Structure ends possibilities. Blackbeard, in the final frame of his era, existed within that closing window of possibility. Not as dominance, not as expansion, but as resistance to disappearance. And resistance, when isolated, always reaches the same limit. Eventually, there is no space left to move within. No uncertainty left to exploit. No unpredictability left to depend on. Only convergence. And convergence does not negotiate. It resolves. Across the remaining Caribbean waters, naval coordination reached full maturity. Encounters were no longer accidental. They were positioned, not always in a single moment, but through alignment of movement over time. And this is what finally ends systems like piracy. Not destruction, but alignment. When every possible path leads toward containment, the system has already ended before contact occurs. Blackbeard's final movements were part of that alignment. Not isolated, not accidental, but part of a broader convergence that had been building for years. And when convergence completes, there is no divergence left. Only outcome. The golden age of piracy, in its final reflection, no longer appeared as chaos. It appeared as structure passing through stages of instability toward conclusion. And within that conclusion, figures like Blackbeard are no longer just participants. They become reference points, markers of transition between eras. Because history does not preserve all motion. It preserves thresholds. And he stood at one. The sea continued after him, as it always does. But what followed was not another age of piracy. It was something fundamentally different. A controlled maritime world shaped by the memory of what had been removed. And in that removal, piracy ceased to be present reality. It became historical identity. A story told after the system that created it had already disappeared. After systems collapse, they do not leave emptiness behind. They leave structure that has already been rewritten. In the Caribbean, the transformation that ended piracy had now fully settled into its second phase. Not conflict, not resistance, but normalization. The sea still carried ships, still carried trade, still carried movement across vast distances. But what it no longer carried was unpredictability born from piracy. That era had been removed not in a single moment, but through accumulation of enforcement until instability could no longer reproduce itself. And once instability cannot reproduce, it disappears. Across ports and coastlines, life adjusted to the new rhythm. Merchant vessels moved with confidence again. Naval patrols became routine rather than exceptional. Communication between maritime powers remained active and continuous. And the ocean that once represented opportunity for those outside the law now represented order maintained through presence. For those who had lived through the transition, the change was not abstract. It was personal, because they remembered when the sea behaved differently, when movement meant uncertainty, when every horizon carried risk, when every voyage required preparation not just for storms, but for confrontation. And that memory lingered longer than the system that created it. Within that memory, figures like Blackbeard had already shifted from presence to reflection. Blackbeard no longer existed as an active force in the world of the Caribbean. He existed as the final expression of an era that had already completed its cycle. His actions had once been shaped by opportunity within instability. But instability itself had been removed from the system around him. And when environment changes completely, even the most adaptive figures become historical rather than active. Elsewhere, the final remnants of piracy continued to dissolve into isolated events rather than organized resistance. Some crews surrendered under structured reintegration systems introduced earlier under Woodes Rogers, returning to formal maritime activity under regulation. But the transition was never symmetrical, because systems that absorb former instability do not restore previous conditions. They replace them, and replacement is permanent. Others attempted to continue resistance in smaller forms. But without networks, without coordination, without safe regions of operation, they no longer formed a system. Only incidents. And incidents do not sustain historical momentum. Across the Caribbean, what had once been a contested ocean had become an organized maritime corridor. Routes were defined. Surveillance was constant. Response was immediate. And piracy, which once exploited delay between action and reaction, could no longer function in that gap, because the gap itself had been removed. This is the final stage of systemic control. Not elimination through force alone, but elimination through removal of opportunity. And without opportunity, behavior cannot persist. Blackbeard's era, when viewed from this stage of history, appears not as chaos, but as a period of imbalance within a system that was already moving toward correction. And correction always completes itself. Not instantly, but structurally. Each removed node reduces possibility for repetition. Each secured route reduces unpredictability. Each coordinated response reduces survival space. Until, eventually, the system stabilizes at a new equilibrium. And piracy, as it existed during its golden age, no longer fits within that equilibrium. The sea that once enabled it now defined its absence. But absence is not silence. It is memory reorganized into history. And history preserves what no longer functions. It does not preserve everything equally. It preserves what marked transition. And in that sense, figures like Blackbeard become anchors of narrative, not because they defined the entire system, but because they marked its final resistance against completion. The world that followed piracy was not simpler. It was structured differently. Trade expanded further than before. Naval power became more coordinated across empires. Maritime law strengthened and standardized. And the ocean became less a space of unknown possibility, and more a managed system of movement. But within that system, the memory of what came before remained embedded. Because once an era exists, it cannot be removed entirely. It can only be transformed into understanding. And understanding replaces experience over time. The Caribbean, in its post-piracy form, was no longer defined by fear of raids or uncertainty of passage. It was defined by control. And control, once established, becomes invisible. Because it is everywhere. And what is everywhere is no longer noticed as force. It becomes assumed reality. Blackbeard's story, within this new structure of the world, no longer belongs to the present. It belongs to the threshold between instability and order, between expansion and restriction, between an ocean that could be taken and an ocean that must now be navigated within rules. And that threshold is where history places its most enduring figures. Not because they ruled it, but because they were the last to move freely within it. When an age ends, it does not leave behind silence. It leaves behind explanation. Because once a system is gone, the world tries to understand how it worked while it still existed. In the Caribbean, that process had begun in full. Piracy was no longer a living force shaping events in real time. It had become something studied, reconstructed, interpreted through records, naval reports, survivor accounts, and imperial correspondence. And with every layer of analysis, the chaotic sea of lived experience began to transform into structured history. What had once been unpredictable movement, became organized narrative. The golden age of piracy was now a defined chapter, not an ongoing reality, but a completed transition. Across maritime archives, patterns were identified: trade disruption cycles, pirate stronghold formations, naval response evolution. And through these patterns, a clearer picture emerged of how instability had grown, peaked, and ultimately been contained. Because piracy did not disappear randomly, it was resolved through systematic pressure over time. And that pressure reshaped the entire ocean. The Caribbean, once a space of fragmented authority, became a coordinated maritime zone, where movement was tracked, where routes were standardized, where response time was minimized through communication networks between naval powers. And this transformation was not temporary. It became structural, permanent in design. Within this reconstructed world, figures like Blackbeard took on a different form, not as living participants, but as defining case studies of the final phase of piracy's existence. Blackbeard represented more than a single man. He represented the threshold at which individual agency collided with systemic control. Because piracy at its height was never just about violence or theft. It was about exploiting the absence of coordination. And once coordination arrived, the system collapsed inward. Not instantly, but inevitably. His movements through the final years of piracy reflected that transition. Not expansion, not domination, but constrained survival within an environment that no longer supported his methods. And that is why his story endures. Not because it is the largest, but because it is the last fully visible expression of a disappearing system. Elsewhere, the final echoes of pirate activity were recorded in diminishing frequency. Isolated encounters at sea, small-scale incidents, former crews attempting reintegration under maritime governance structures established earlier through policies associated with Woodes Rogers. But these were no longer part of a network. They were residual events. And residual events do not define eras. They close them. The Caribbean itself now functioned under a new logic. Not domination through fear, but stability through coordination. Trade routes expanded further than ever before. Colonial powers strengthened their maritime presence. Naval infrastructure improved across multiple empires simultaneously. Because piracy had revealed a truth they all recognized too late. That control of the sea is not achieved once. It must be maintained continuously. And continuous maintenance requires systems. Systems that had been built directly in response to the era that pirates once dominated. So even in absence, piracy shaped the world that replaced it. This is the paradox of historical collapse. What disappears often becomes the foundation of what follows. Blackbeard's world was gone, but the structures built to eliminate it remained. And those structures define the next era of maritime history more than piracy itself ever could. In this sense, he exists not only as an endpoint of piracy, but as a cause embedded within the systems that replaced it. Because history does not erase conflict. It absorbs it, and then builds order upon its resolution. The sea, in its modern form compared to that era, no longer reflects the same uncertainties. Storms remain. Navigation remains challenging. But unpredictability born from human systems has been largely reduced. Because surveillance, coordination, and communication now form a continuous layer over maritime movement. And that layer did not exist before piracy reached its peak. It was built because of it. So the legacy of piracy is not only destruction or legend. It is structure, a global maritime order shaped by the need to prevent its return. And within that order, Blackbeard remains a fixed reference point, not as active threat, not as surviving force, but as the final articulation of a system that had to be fully understood before it could be removed. His name endures not because piracy continued, but because it ended through a process that required figures like him to define its final boundary. And once boundaries are defined, systems do not revert. They evolve beyond them. The Caribbean, in its completed transformation, now exists as a space defined by what it once was rather than what it is. And that is how historical eras persist. Not through continuation, but through structured memory. And memory, once stabilized into history, becomes permanent. When a system is fully replaced, what remains is not emptiness. It is order that has forgotten it was built to replace something. In the Caribbean, that forgetting had already begun. Generations that grew up after piracy's collapse no longer experienced the sea as a contested space. They experienced it as infrastructure, a route, a network, a managed environment shaped by rules they never saw being formed. And because they never saw the instability that came before, they could not fully imagine it. This is how historical transformation becomes permanent, not through force alone, but through loss of lived comparison. The ocean still carried ships across vast distances. Trade still flowed between continents. Colonial and imperial powers still competed for influence. But they now operated within a maritime system that assumed coordination as default, not exception. And that assumption was the final victory over piracy, because piracy had depended on the opposite assumption. That coordination would always be incomplete. That response would always lag behind action. That space would always exist between decision and enforcement. But that space had been closed, not suddenly, but structurally, through decades of adaptation, enforcement, and maritime evolution. And once that space disappeared, the system piracy depended on could no longer regenerate. Across historical records, the transformation is described not as a single war, but as a prolonged correction of maritime imbalance, a shift from fragmented authority to coordinated control, from opportunistic violence to regulated movement, from unpredictable waters to monitored corridors. And within that transformation, figures like Blackbeard remain central not because they dominated the entire system, but because they existed at the exact point where the old system stopped functioning and the new one began to take shape. Blackbeard represents that final intersection, a moment where individual agency collided with a collapsing structure, where reputation briefly substituted for system, and where survival depended on navigating a world that was already moving beyond the rules that created him. He is remembered not as an isolated phenomenon, but as the last clearly visible expression of a disappearing order. Because after that point, piracy no longer existed as a coherent system. Only fragmented incidents remained, and those incidents were no longer capable of shaping the sea. They were absorbed into enforcement mechanisms that had already been established. Elsewhere in historical reconstruction, the final phase of pirate dissolution is often linked to administrative and naval reforms carried out under officials such as Woodes Rogers, whose role in re-establishing controlled governance in former pirate strongholds contributed to the final breakdown of organized piracy networks. But even these actions were not isolated solutions. They were part of a larger, empire-wide recognition that maritime instability required coordinated long-term systems rather than reactive force. And that recognition reshaped global naval strategy permanently. The result was not simply the end of piracy, but the beginning of modern maritime governance. Standardized patrol structures, formalized trade protections, international cooperation frameworks that would evolve further over centuries, all of which emerged in response to the era that piracy defined. This is why the golden age of piracy occupies such a unique place in history. Because it did not simply end. It transformed the system that ended it. And in doing so, it became embedded in the structure of the world that followed. The Caribbean today, when viewed historically, is not remembered only for piracy itself, but for the transition it forced. From fragmented control to coordinated enforcement. From isolated authority to networked power. From unpredictable seas to regulated movement. And within that transition, Blackbeard remains a symbolic endpoint. Not because he changed the system alone, but because he existed at the final moment before it fully changed. After him, there is no comparable figure who represents piracy at the same structural level. Because the structure that created such figures no longer existed. And when structure disappears, so do the conditions that produce its defining individuals. What remains instead is reflection, interpretation, historical reconstruction. And within that reconstruction, piracy becomes less an active force and more a lens through which the development of maritime order is understood. Blackbeard's legacy, therefore, is not confined to piracy alone. It extends into how modern maritime systems were formed in response to the vulnerabilities his era exposed. He exists at the boundary between two worlds, one defined by fragmentation and one defined by coordination. And that boundary is where history places its most significant transitions. Because it is not the dominance of a system that defines its importance, but the moment it ceases to function. And what replaces it? History rarely ends with a final blow. It ends with adjustment, a slow settling of systems that no longer need to prove themselves. In the Caribbean, that adjustment had already completed itself. The waters were still there. The storms still came. The trade routes still stretched across vast distances. But the world that moved through them was no longer the world of piracy. It was something reorganized, structured, stabilized through coordination that had been built in response to years of instability. And over time, even that instability became difficult to imagine in full. Not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer matched lived experience. Ships no longer sailed, expecting interception. Naval presence was no longer exceptional. It was constant, and that constancy reshaped everything. The golden age of piracy, once defined by unpredictability and expansion, now existed only as a completed historical phase. A closed system in academic terms. A finished transformation in practical terms. But within that closure, certain figures remained fixed in memory, not as active participants, but as defining points of transition. Among them, Blackbeard stands as one of the final and most recognizable expressions of that era. not because he alone shaped piracy, but because his presence coincided with its final structural collapse. He existed at the edge of two worlds, one where maritime power was fragmented and exploitable, and one where it was coordinated and enforced. And that position is what gives his story its lasting weight. Because he was not just part of piracy, he was part of its end conditions. After his time, piracy no longer returns in the same form. It becomes scattered incidents, isolated threats, occasional disruptions rather than systemic forces. The structure that once allowed it to flourish had been permanently altered. And that alteration was not accidental. It was the result of sustained adaptation by maritime powers that had learned from the instability piracy created. Naval coordination expanded. Trade protection systems improved. Communication between empires increased. And over time, the sea became something managed rather than contested. Even former pirate havens were transformed through governance and reintegration efforts associated with figures such as Woodes Rogers, whose administrative reforms in places like the Bahamas helped finalize the transition from pirate-controlled zones to regulated colonial maritime order. But even this transformation was only one part of a larger global shift, because what happened in the Caribbean did not remain isolated. It influenced how empires understood maritime security everywhere. It shaped naval doctrine. It shaped trade protection systems. It shaped the idea that control of the sea required constant coordination rather than temporary dominance. So piracy, in its final form, did not simply end. It was absorbed into the structure that replaced it. Its existence became the justification for modern maritime control systems. Its collapse became the blueprint for prevention, and its most prominent figures became reference points in understanding how systems fail and how they are rebuilt. Blackbeard's legacy, then, is not defined by victory or defeat. It is defined by position. He stands at the boundary where one system ended and another began. And boundaries are what history preserves most clearly, because they mark change that cannot be undone. The Caribbean today carries no trace of piracy as a dominant force, but it carries the systems built to ensure that it never becomes one again. And that is the final form of historical influence. Not survival, but transformation of what comes after. The sea continues as it always has, but it no longer carries the same uncertainty that once defined an entire age. And within that change, the story of piracy is no longer ongoing. It is complete, not erased, not forgotten, but resolved into history. And in that resolution, Blackbeard remains as one of its final echoes, not as a ruler of the sea, but as a marker of the moment the sea stopped being ruled that way at all.